I want to tell you a little bit about today's guests and how we're going to structure the conversation. Navigating Quicksand, Supporting Crossover Youth. It's the title of the final report from the Crossover Youth Project, and we're so pleased that we have 4 different people who represent different aspects of the work of this project. Dr. Judy Finlay and Justice Brian Scully are the co-chairs of the project. Judy is the longest standing child advocate in Canada and was Ontario's Child and Youth Advocate from 1991 to 2007. She is currently Associate Professor at Ryerson University in the Faculty of Community Services. Justice Scully practiced criminal, youth justice, family, and child protection law in the City of Toronto following his call to the Bar of Ontario. In 1983, he became a member of the official Guardians panel representing children in protection proceedings. In 1993, he was a Canadian delegate at the Executive Council meeting of the International Association for the Prevention of Child Abuse. He was a witness and presenter to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Legal Affairs pertaining to the Young Offenders Act in 1992 and 1994. And in 2001 and 2002, he served as a member of the National Judicial Institute Committee on the development and teaching of youth justice curriculum for judges prior to the enactment of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. Matthew Eaton-Kent is a criminal defense lawyer with his own practice, Eaton-Kent Law. His practice has a significant focus on youth with child welfare backgrounds, and Matthew is also a part-time academic professor at Humber College. Jessica Salerno has been a practicing social worker for 13 years, and she was the case conference facilitator with the Crossover Youth Project, where she provided training and education to community stakeholders and the understanding of crossover youth and the challenges they face. She is also in the process of completing her certification to become a family group conference facilitator. And Shantel Hyndman is a child and youth worker. She is a 26-year-old African-Canadian child and youth worker and a former Crown Ward. She also formerly worked at the Child Advocate's Office as an amplifier on the Hair Story Project, which acted as a catalyst in her interest exploring issues of race within the social services sector. She remains actively engaged in challenging anti-Black racism and mobilizing children, youth, and families in her community. And Shantel is going to offer us a frontline perspective after we hear a little bit more about the Crossover Youth Project. We're going to start with a video of about 11 minutes that gives an overview to the project. Matthew will then share key findings and case examples, and Jessica will share her experiences with case conferencing on the project. Shantel will then provide a frontline perspective on some of the issues that the project surfaces, and then we'll have a facilitated conversation with all of our guests, including Judy and Brian. We recognize that this is a nuanced and in-depth conversation and that we may not be able to cover all of the ground we want to today. So we're using the Crossover Youth Project as an entry point to this conversation, and we hope to be able to host a part 2 on this topic within the next few weeks. So now we'll start with the video that gives you an overview of the Crossover Youth Project.
Crossover youth are young persons who become enmeshed or involved in both the youth justice system and the child welfare system. They often come from families where they either suffered from neglect or abuse, or where there was a conflict between parent and child. Child agencies become involved. Once the children and youth find themselves in the agency's scope, they often have their first introduction into the criminal justice system. Once they're there, the child care system tends to want to leave them in the criminal justice system and have that system provide services for them. There are services available in the youth justice system that aren't available at this point in children's services. And so those charged with care of these children and youth want to avail themselves of those services in the youth system. Sadly, that can result in the young people, without the support of traditional community parents, languishing in detention for long periods of time, in some cases, tragically, perhaps a year. We wanted to focus on making sure that these young people, once they were in the justice system, that we could get them out of that system as quickly as possible and put them back into the care of those who must plan for them on a long-term basis through children's services. And for many of these young people that have suffered trauma and the difficulties in their lives, the criminal justice system is simply the worst place for them to be.
Crossover youth have very complex backgrounds and they come into a very complicated system. These young people come from families where there's been trauma, loss, chaos, or conflict. Crossover youth come into child welfare care when they're early teens, so let's say 13 to 15 years old. And when they come into care, because they are early teens, foster care is not available to them. And so they move fairly rapidly. In fact, they do move into group care. And so you can imagine for the first time leaving your family and moving into an environment that you're just not comfortable with or not familiar with. And also, they're not just leaving their family. More often than not, they're leaving their community as well. So their response often to those circumstances is to act out behaviorally. And whatever they learned in their family in terms of interaction patterns, they replicate. They absolutely replicate it in the group care settings they find themselves in. And if workers aren't incredibly skilled in terms of how to manage these young people, then they respond in a way that is typical to these young people that they would expect from their parents. And so they become quite agitated and act out. The end result often, particularly early on when they've just moved into this group care setting, is that group care staff call police as a behavioral management strategy. And that is when these young people get their first charge.
Primary goal of the project was to find better outcomes for young persons that found themselves enmeshed in the youth criminal justice system and the child welfare system.
So I think we've known for quite a while that there is a trajectory of young people from child welfare into the youth justice system, and we want to interrupt that trajectory at very many intersection points between first entry into child welfare all the way through to group care, charging practices, bail conditions, detention, and later on, deeper penetration into the youth justice system.
The focus of the project was, once young people are enmeshed in the two systems, to try and remove them from the criminal justice system as soon as possible. They may have had difficulties in their home, in their community, but once they're in detention, they're then exposed to, at times, very violent and very aggressive individuals. The vulnerability of these crossover youth is they're just not prepared to deal with that kind of risk and that kind of that's posed by the other young persons that are in detention. And the worst case scenario is that they find community there. They find community with those that are in detention. And then that starts them on a trajectory that will likely end in the penitentiary. Our goal is to persuade and advocate to children's services to not abandon these young people into the criminal justice system, but rather take them back and plan for them in the child care system and provide the services that they need in order to be successful. We do this through conferencing, bringing all the people, all the various agencies, all the persons to the table and develop a plan. Hold people accountable from the various sectors that intersect with these young people. Hold them accountable for taking action and providing services for them. And keeping everybody, the expression perhaps, their feet to the fire. And our conference coordinators were very successful in doing that.
So when we look at crossover youth and we were looking at the circumstances they found themselves in, we developed two layers of intervention, if you want to call it that. One is, like Brian is saying, case conferencing. So bringing the people in the young person's life together and making a plan. But at the second level is the systemic level. So, and the systemic level of change, policy change, moving towards legislative change, program change, practice change, was really informed by cases.
One of the difficulties that we encountered was, while we had a great deal of commitment by those that came to our steering committee provincially to affect change and provide better outcomes for these young people. We found resistance with those that actually worked at the base level with these young persons. They're workers, they're lawyers. We all become familiar with the manner in which we operate. And so we found that probation officers, childcare workers, lawyers operated in silos. They had a certain way that they approached these young people, and it was difficult to move them at the ground level to open them to consider different approaches and to be open to working with other agencies or other persons that were involved in these young people's lives. For good reason, lawyers are cynical and skeptical of those that work in the criminal justice system of the state. They are to challenge the state. And it was difficult to persuade defense counsel that in working with these young people, given lots of protection for confidentiality, that they could open themselves and open their clients to meeting with others and trying to plan to provide a better outcome for them.
Interestingly, very early on in the project, very early on, it's a 4-year project, so I would say halfway through the first year, we learned from young people talking to us, but also watching young people interact with various parts of the system or sitting at our case conferences. We learned from them very quickly that we had to work with, engage, partner with young people in very specific ways. We had to take into account what we call 3 pillars. The first one is trauma-informed care. Working with these young people from a trauma-informed lens. And that's for the reasons we've talked about, that they come from backgrounds of trauma. And so if you're not aware of that and you're not interacting with young people from that kind of lens, that kind of anticipation, then you can be triggering and you can be provoking behavioral responses that are difficult to manage or difficult to understand. Another pillar is anti-oppressive practice. We learned in Toronto, we've learned in Belleville, we learned in Thunder Bay, we learned in Brantford that the majority of these young people are racialized youth or Indigenous. And there's overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black youth in the crossover youth population. And so we all need to have a very clear understanding of the implications of that and how you interact with these young people in an anti-oppressive manner. And the third one, and from my perspective, just my perspective, it's probably the most important one, and we learned about this even before we started the project when we're engaging with the communities, is you need to center youth. For youth to thrive, to grow, they need to know that they have a voice, but more importantly, they need to know that when they have a voice, it makes change. Or when they have a voice, it contributes to important decisions that are being made about them. And we learned very, very early that service providers, whether it be in the courts, whether it be in children's services, whether it be in child welfare, whether it be in education, whether it be the police, were dismissing the voice of young people and thinking somehow that they knew what was best for them. When we've learned that young people know better than anyone, because they have the lived experience, what's important to them. So those are the 3 pillars then: trauma-informed care practice, anti-oppressive practice, and youth centering. So this video will give you information about anti-oppressive practice and trauma-informed practice. And the young people themselves have created what they call a zine, which tells you about youth centering and how you do that.
And I will just add that there is a featured collection on YouthREX's Knowledge Hub where you can access, again, as I mentioned, the final report, the site-specific reports, as well as the videos that were mentioned in addition to this video. So that's a resource that's available to folks who are interested in watching and learning more about the projects. And I think at this point, we're going to invite Matthew to speak a little bit more about the key findings and potentially some case examples. And Matthew, maybe you can introduce yourself. I did a very brief introduction at the outset, but if you want to introduce yourself and speak to your role with the project, that would also be great.
Yes. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and that helped to inform my role with the project. I was the resource coordinator, and I worked on the systemic. I worked on systemic issues. The way the project was set up is that there was casework at each one of the sites, and then I tried to translate the way that the roadblocks that the youth were facing as they were trying to navigate the system, and the case conference facilitators were coming across and trying to translate that into solutions and recommendations for systemic change. So the reports that we wrote are based on that experience, and we worked collaboratively on that. So everybody was contributing, but I would say that my main role was consulting with the youth, consulting with stakeholders at the sites, following the cases, and trying to translate that into policies that could be universalized, despite how unique each one of the youth cases are. We found a lot of the same issues coming up case after case. So to dive into some of the findings, the first one we had that was surprising to us was that a majority of the youth that we followed entered the care of CAS not because of protection concerns, but because of parent-teen conflict. And then that seemed like a sort of a particular failure, that when people were reaching out for assistance, that then the response of the system was to bring them in and then criminalize them. So that was the finding was a key piece in the general theme of the child welfare to prison pipeline that's confirmed in a lot of the research outside of our project, but was confirmed by our experience that following and providing service to the youth that participated in our project. So there was a lot of situations, like Dr. Finlay said, where the young people are coming into care at the age of, between 13 and 15. There are very limited foster care type of arrangements available, and so they're going into group care, and those are run as institutions. The staff may be not much older than the young people that they're supposed to be providing service to. The group care facilities are over-promising the services and under-delivering them, and they very much offload the disciplinary component or behavior management component of their work to the police. And it was seemed like a cost-saving method. Also, the training was somewhat limited, or there wasn't a lot of incentive not to call the police, and as soon as the police arrived to deal with things that in most family homes you would not engage police for, showing up past curfew, slamming a door, throwing a Tupperware container, that was, the police would come up with a corresponding criminal charge for that, and then they'd be in the system. And then particularly the administrative justice offenses were ones that kept that pipeline going, and especially non-criminal behavior, again, curfew breaches, not residing where they were supposed to, and because they would be placed by the child welfare system in jurisdictions that they are unfamiliar with, that aren't responsive to their culture, that are purposefully very far away from where they grew up, and the natural human reaction would be to leave a place like that, and yet the system came along to criminalize them. And then sort of the most tragic component of that pipeline, which we encountered in the project, was that pipeline graduating the young people into the adult system. And again, that's where the administrative justice offenses often played a big role, in that the young person would be on a release or a probation order for something they'd done when they were 16, 17, and that would continue to the age of 18, and then they would get an adult charge, and that would potentially set them down a path of not being able to find employment and having challenges with that. So there's a case study here. Wayne is a 17-year-old who identifies as a Black male. He lived with his biological mother until infancy. He was diagnosed with FASD. His biological mother struggled with addiction, and as a result was no longer able to care for Wayne. He was then adopted by his aunt, whom he calls mom. Wayne presents with symptomology reflecting PTSD. He was never diagnosed with this. However, his aunt advocated to get him the supports he needed. In the end, he did not receive them, and as a result, she felt very discouraged. As Wayne reached adolescence, his needs became greater, and his aunt was no longer able to care for him. Since then, Wayne has had approximately 15 placements throughout Ontario. Every time Wayne leaves a placement, it's because the home refuses to service him any longer. And Wayne received his first criminal charge in the group home after throwing a chair at a staff member out of frustration. Since then, Wayne's been charged in the community and in a number of placements. And that was just a very typical kind of case. And the pattern I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which as soon as there's a criminal charge, they're likely shipped off to the next placement. So it's incredibly disruptive, and there's no time to get settled, and any plans you have for service and things are thrown out the window because they're on to a new location. And you know, we also came across a lot of youth that came from very far away, placed coming from the northern Indigenous reserves, either into Thunder Bay or all the way down to southern Ontario. And we have another case study here that's particularly reflective of that, where they, you know, there's a small amount of theft and some breaches, and yet you know, they have to reside in Thunder Bay because they can't be released back to their community because of how many court appearances, you know, they're adjourned every month. And then because they're so far away from any supports, they're housing insecure, they have a very difficult time getting to the courthouse because the shelter is so far from the court. And now, you know, we're potentially picking up breaches about that. And you know, it's just a cycle that you can't get out of, and it's really unfortunate that something as small as some shoplifting can require you to live for a whole year in a place that you don't want to, just so that your matter makes the way through the court and all your rights are sort of preserved along the process, and you're not just being forced to plead guilty. So those are some of our findings. A major theme was also the racial disparity in Toronto. The youth that spend the longest amount of time in pretrial custody were all Black youth, sometimes as much as over a year. And so that was an incredibly troubling finding and horrible impact on the young people that happened to. So I'll turn it over to Jessica to talk about case conferencing, which was one of our solutions that we were trying to bring to the issues that we observed.
I guess you just put the camera on me, right? Okay, hi. So I'm Jessica Salerno. I was the case conference facilitator for the Toronto site with the crossover project. So my role was basically to do the groundwork, the casework, which my findings essentially guided Matthew with in his role as a resource coordinator, guided him in creating structural change, which was done through creation of like best practice models, protocols, with the hopes that to change some of the structural barriers that I identified through my casework. So as a case conference facilitator, the role of case conferencing was established as a mechanism to facilitate collaboration across all service sectors. Crossover youth typically have a lot of service agencies and service stakeholders involved in their lives, and oftentimes they often make they have a lot of planning and plans of cares and plans of services that are somewhat repetitive of each other, and it's sometimes difficult for youth to follow because there's multiple case plans. So part of my role was to bring everyone together to establish one case plan for the youth. A big piece with what I did was first and foremost, I would get consent from the youth to make sure that they were on board and okay with engaging in the process of a case conference. Once the youth consented, I would get the consent from the defense counsel to make sure that they were okay with engaging in this process as well. And so from there, we would talk about what the youth wanted to talk about in a case conference, the point of the case conference. I've conducted case conferences to address maybe lack of communication with service workers. I've done case conferences to discuss and establish bail conditions, placement options, a lot, all kinds of issues. And I found that a lot of the so during a case conference, typically people that were in attendance were, so myself, the youth, we often had a youth mentor working alongside with the youth to ensure that, checking in with the youth to make sure that they were okay during the conference process. We had oftentimes a defense counsel, the children's aid lawyer, the children's aid worker, the OCL, if they were involved, the Crown, probation, if they were involved, sometimes Native court workers. I've had principals, teachers, I've also had police. I've had, I can't think of, I've had a lot of attendees from varying stakeholders. So we would all come together and basically, if the youth was comfortable speaking, they would speak on their behalf and talk about what it is that they wanted to address, or they would ask that I speak on their behalf. And again, the whole point of the conference was to bring all the different service sectors together to really highlight what it is, like what's going on in the youth's life, what it is that they need from their perspective, and how we can all kind of plan together to make sure that we're not maybe overlapping services, and to make sure that the right services are in place. So that pretty much, I'm trying to think of case conferencing. We did informal case conferences, which were just basically, they could have been over the phone through through teleconference. They could have been just outside the courthouse, where we just with the youth and just gather people that were around. We had formal case conferences, which were scheduled and planned, and agendas were set out. And then there were court-ordered case conferences that were led by a judge. And yeah, I think that's, so that I'll leave it at that. And then I'm sure if there's any other questions, we can get into more of the casework or the case conferencing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Matthew. I think I'd love to invite Shantel to join us, and we wanted to make sure that Shantel had some space to speak a little bit about her experiences and the ways in which she enters into this conversation as a frontline worker who was not engaged in the project per se, but who has experience working with crossover youth and in the sector with a variety of different populations. So Shantel, we'll invite you to join us. Hi. Well, we can't hear you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Katie, for introducing me. So again, my name is Shantel. I work in the frontline sector of this field. I am a child and youth worker. And in my career so far, I have had opportunities to work at multiple different levels of the system. The bulk of my career has been in the community setting. I've created programs, I've run programs, I've done informal counseling, but I've also worked on a government level, working at the advocate's office, and also on a very frontline level, working in transitional shelters and residential homes. In terms of what I've experienced at each level of the field that I have worked in, I've seen a direct correlation with a lot of the young people I've worked in, and oh yes, I've also worked in the child welfare sector as well. I've seen a direct correlation between involvement with the justice system as well as the child welfare system. I really do appreciate all of the different elements that have been added to this particular program and learning more in depth about what it is the program aims to achieve in terms of the overall vision. And in saying that, recognizing the fact that majority of crossover youth are racialized and indigenous, and within my practice since the beginning, I always employ an anti-racist lens and a critical race lens to my work. I'm very much aware of the fact that majority of the field does utilize an AOP lens in the work, but I've recognized over time in my practice that there's a little bit of a danger for myself and actually many practitioners in using AOP as an umbrella to working with Black youth and Indigenous youth when there's a lot of other issues that our youth face on a daily basis that pertains to anti-Black racism that runs rampant through through various systems, right, that they interact with. In terms of my time in the community setting, I did find that I interacted with many young people that came from all across Ontario. I developed and led a program called Black Youth in Transition for 4 years. The program is still up and running, and it aims to provide a wraparound approach and services to working with our young people in the community and utilizing best practice approaches when working with Black families and young people. Many of the young people that I worked with during my time there, I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names, but I'm fairly certain it was Matthew who brought it up, and I really appreciate that a lot of times, a lot of these young people are taken out of their communities and brought to communities that are so far away from what they know and where they've grown up in. And working with these young people, I recognize that in them being taken out of their communities and put in these communities that they're not familiar with, many of them have echoed very similar sentiments of feeling othered, the racism that happens in the environments in which they take up space on a daily basis, the feelings of and the lack of cultural inclusivity that they experience on a daily basis. I've worked with numerous Black young people who hate themselves and the internal racism that they feel is a byproduct of interacting with the child welfare system and the youth justice system. So I've seen a lot of different complex issues present when working with this particular demographic. And myself being a former Crown Ward and having that experience in child welfare learning how to navigate a very, very oppressive and racist system while also ensuring that my needs are met. I see myself trying to equip my young people with those same skills because it's a large, grand system, right? And sometimes young people, a lot of times the kids that I have worked with, they don't understand their rights. They don't understand what's next for them. Sometimes just getting from day to day is difficult. And in terms of that trauma-informed lens, that's always plays a central role in the work that I do. In terms of what I've seen and experienced working on a frontline level, many of you guys also echoed the same sentiments around police being one of the measures taken in order to, I guess you could say, engage in some form of crisis de-escalation. I've seen police calls be crisis intervention, and me working from an anti-racist and critical race lens, and even an intersectional lens, recognizing how that one interaction with the police will potentially put them on a path that they didn't know that they were going, right? So I recognized in my practice that some of the practice approaches that are taken on a frontline level actually do facilitate a lot of the barriers and heightened challenges that our kids face. It also goes without saying that growing up as a young Black individual within this system is very, very difficult. The system is not culturally responsive to the needs of racialized youth and Indigenous youth. And I do also want to highlight, I know I've highlighted anti-Black racism and the issues in which my community face, but in the Indigenous community, they also face a lot of anti-Native racism as well, right? And we see that play out in the community. We're seeing that play out in society, on the media, and a lot of times I've recognized that from a frontline level, many times practitioners do feel that the issues that they're hearing about or they're seeing on the media don't pertain to our young people. I'm sorry, there's so many different things that I have seen, experienced, and mediated in. Another major thing that I'm always conscious about is how well Black young people present. We are a very resilient community in the face of oppression and racism and marginalization. We stand extremely strong, and that is one factor that I always do believe that needs to be highlighted in terms of our strengths and resiliency as a people, right? And the same is to be said about the Indigenous community. So what I've seen is when engaged in counseling and informal counseling with young people, you see that there is a lot of trauma there, and the trauma is operating in conjunction with the other layers of oppression that they experience on a daily basis. I also really want to highlight the fact that our community is not monolithic, and in terms of the responses that we have seen from integrated into policies and procedures when working with racialized youth, you see some of the responses to working in our community as this monolithic response that one size fits all for every young person that identifies as Black, and that's very dangerous as well, and sometimes I've seen has pushed a lot of young people even further on the margins. So in terms of working in child welfare, all of the young people I worked with in the child welfare sector, especially mostly the males, they had some or a lot. It varied per young person in regards to the experience they had with the youth criminal justice system. When speaking to these young men, you kind of see the light in their eyes go out, and you see their passions, and you see the things that they once thought that they could achieve completely diminish, right? And because you're up against two extremely strong systems that are breaking you down. During my time at OPACE, God rest OPACE's soul, I loved that place. In terms of doing the Hair Story project, we did a 5-day event called Black Youth Unite for Arts, and ARTS was an acronym that stood for a right to speak, a symbolic, it was a symbolic term to just to demonstrate how our community, Black and African community, we're very creative in the ways that we advocate for ourselves, and we spoke in an artistic way on an artistic platform. But a lot of the young people that came to that event, the spark lit up in their eyes. Back to what Matthew was saying about being whisked away and put into communities that you don't identify with and are very unsure about. A lot of young people lose who they are, and they have no choice but to assimilate in order to survive. So our survival instincts in my community are high, and we can survive in the wake of anything. And you see that for youth that are 13 and 14 and 15 years old. I hear it over and over again. I had to do what I had to do to survive. If that meant removing my Blackness for the year or 2-year duration of time that I was enmeshed in this community, that is what I had to do to survive. And just recognizing the resilience and the protective factors in which young people employ to keep themselves safe, right? Culturally keep themselves safe, mentally keep themselves safe, physically and spiritually. But another factor that I saw when facilitating the Black Youth Unite for Arts program was the fact that many young people were placed in a position where they felt that they were the only one experiencing these issues. And the Hair Story project brought them all together to, send a message like, look around. There are numerous young people just like yourselves who are experiencing the same thing, and just teaching young people that this is a systemic issue way grander than yourself. But it just goes to show you how the system sets them up to take on, I guess, the fall and the brunt of their feelings, and a lot of young people end up channeling that through their actions and behaviors. The system continues to send these messages to our young men that they're not going to value, they're not going to amount to anything, and that they have no value. So when you speak life into a young person, they will give you life back. And when you speak ill into a young person, you will see them become a product of those very words and phrases and statements that you have attached to their being, right? But in terms of crossover youth, I've recognized it to be a large issue. And even in the program that I ran, Black Youth in Transition, so it was a program for youth aged 13 to 19 who were coming out of care, providing them a kind of a soft place to land, and wraparound supports. I offered informal counseling, mentorship, community connections, and we fostered relationships with caregivers as decided upon by that young person, as well as expanded their network so that they have a culturally safe network of individuals to bounce off of. And that's really what I wanted the program to be. But after about year 2 into my program, I recognized that there were still elements that I needed to integrate. How do I integrate the youth justice aspect? Because many of these young people were coming out of the justice system and completely lost, needing somewhere to land, really. But when coming out of the justice system and looking at it from a critical race lens, this young person needs trauma-informed support, they need culturally responsive support, and they need support that, highlights every single aspect of what they've, every single aspect of their experiences, and you see how complex the situation is and complex the needs are for young people. There's also a large lack of trust in authority within our system, because a lot of young people have been burned by frontline staff, by child welfare personnel, by school teachers. That a lot of times I've seen with the young people that have come through my program, and having my intakes with them and seeing where they're at in life, you hear a lot of their stories start in the education system, the educational streamlining that our kids go through, and in terms of how they take on the belief systems of the staff, of educational personnel, when they tell them that they can't amount to anything. As I said earlier, they start to embody that, and you start seeing that reflected in their behaviors. And so I have seen in my practice so far that a lot of the behaviors that are demonstrated by youth in my community, it was actually facilitated by the system, right? When you add those experiences in conjunction with the trauma that they're coming into our care to address, it's just this large snowball effect. So I've just been sitting here over the past half an hour, 45, just listening to the program, the Crossover Youth Program, the 3 pillars, and how the program aims to address a lot of the issues that are prevalent in my community as well as the Indigenous community. But what I would also say is the importance of centering race in that, right? The statistics are there in regards to child welfare. Our community, as well as the Indigenous community, overpopulates the child welfare system. We overpopulate the youth criminal justice system, and crossover youth go from the child welfare system right to the criminal justice system too. Centering our identities and our Blackness is key in this work. And there is a danger in not centering it, as young people have already had to grow up in these environments that don't foster their cultural backgrounds and their needs, and even mental health in terms of our young people. Again, a lot of the points brought up by Matthew, having the police called on you for a cup. I've heard that numerous times. I've heard young people come into my program, okay, why are you here? What's going on? What happened? Tell me your side of the story. I was overwhelmed. I've been depressed over the past 3 weeks, and I clenched my fist because, Shantel, I am so overwhelmed. Staff backed up. They perceived me to be aggressive. They thought that I was going to assault them, even though they were on the other side of the room, and I didn't even have a chance to stick up for myself, defend myself. The police were called right away. And in doing that work and seeing that happened to my own sibling as well. And me already being engaged in this work, I was able to get her out of the situation. But there are a lot of young people that are not able to advocate for themselves. They have not been equipped with those skills and equipped with the knowledge in terms of how to navigate systems and how to get safely from the criminal justice system through to the mental health system, through to the child welfare system. So yeah, I've seen a lot, I've experienced a lot. And in terms of the work that I do, and I'm actively always engaged in, is challenging anti-Black racism. It's at every level, even working, I've worked in the Child and Youth Department at Ryerson University, engaged in race-related research in regards to our field, and you see that we continue to see the same issues present themselves. And so for me, I always center race in all of this because many of our young people have been conditioned over time in their time in the child welfare system and the youth criminal justice system to suppress who they are. I have worked with a lot of my Black males. You hear them echo very similar sentiments. After the 4th or 5th time experiencing a traumatic interaction, whether it be with the staff at in their schools or the police that have been present in their schools, that they learn very quickly that they need to act a certain way, present in a certain manner, in order to not be criminalized and dehumanized. And young people have actually used that word. I feel dehumanized even when I engage with these individuals who are supposed to be there to support me and ensure my sustainability in the community after their care. You can see it in their eyes that they don't value me, they don't see me as worthy, right? So in terms of doing work with crossover youth, there are so many different intersectional elements that need to be addressed. I've seen, even with doing my program for 4 years, over the course of 4 years, I had to constantly go back to the drawing board and add different elements. And one thing I always saw was that the Black community is becoming extremely fluid, and a lot of our kids are going against the wider societal narratives in regards to what it means to be a Black youth. What does that look like? There's no proper way or one way of identifying as Black, African, or Caribbean. And in that, they are exploring their sexual identities. They are feeling comfortable and safe in who they are, and they're speaking up and they're living in their truth. But when you look at it from a larger lens, you have a young Black male identifying young person who also identifies under the LGBTQ spectrum, and that just positions those young people even further on the margin. So how do we address all the different complexities of Black and Indigenous youth identities, while ensuring that they safely transition from one system to the next? And what I have noticed is that I've worked with a lot of racialized youth, and in learning their, learning their stories, some of them did need to come into child welfare services in order to ensure their protection. That there was no doubt about that. I've worked with young people who were solely in the care of the province because our cultures didn't align with the system, right? So you see ABR and ANR, so anti-Native racism and anti-Black racism, uprooting itself in different ways, right? Like if our Black families don't operate and we're not structured the way society views the nuclear family, a lot of times that's looked at as abuse, and taking a child out of their home and the comfort and of their family is actually extremely traumatic. So in this program, I would ask or be interested to know how we address the trauma that the system puts these kids in, because I have worked with young kids who have said, I never had any negative experiences at home, and my trauma started the moment that social worker came to my house, right? And I've been on this spiraling. I've been spiraling ever since. I don't know how to stop, because I've picked up these methods of survival. They've worked for me. Yeah, I may have gotten picked up a couple times by the cops, but when I look at the grander picture, I'm surviving. So how do we address that trauma as well? There's
really good, Shantel, maybe to open it up to our other guests, because I think one of the questions that came up with some of the folks participating in the webinar is, how do you address intersectionality in terms of identity? How do you recognize trauma? How do you respond relationally with the young people with whom you're working? And then how do you also hold the systems accountable to respond in the ways that we are hoping that we can respond as practitioners? So, so thank you so much, Shantel, for sharing your experiences. And I want to welcome all of our guests and ask us if there's anything that Shantel shared that you want to respond to, or if you want to speak a little bit to her question of like, how do we actually do this work? What does this actually look like relationally?
I think we're in complete agreement that the system is traumatizing in and of itself. and the system, the responses that the system have as a default are the problem, and not the solution. And our project is, the 3 pillars are anti-oppressive practice, having a trauma-informed lens, and being youth-centered. But tying all those things together, I think first and foremost, it's about not punishing the youth. They didn't do anything wrong, and to get themselves in the situation that they did, and these things are all happening to them, and yet all the consequences fall on the shoulders of the young people, and that can be including all the intergenerational consequences are resting on the shoulder of the young people. So all parts of our practice and our recommendations come from that lens.
Did anyone else want to add anything on that particular point? I mean, I'm wondering, and maybe this is something that Jessica, you can speak to, you know, case conferencing is an approach to doing this work, and in this particular instance was a strategy, because I know the needs assessment before the project even began really identified that there was a lack of cross-sectoral collaboration. And so it seems, based on what you've described and what I've read, that the case conference is really an opportunity to do that youth centering work, and really to make sure that everyone involved has a chance to hear from the young person and also has a chance to hear from one another in that relational way. Is that something that is modeled already in the sector in working with crossover youth? Is this something that, because I know case conferencing exists as a potential strategy among folks working on the front lines, whether they be social workers or other types of practitioners. So how does that work, and how do we create space for that to happen, and create resources for that to happen?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yes. So I mean, in terms of the case conferencing, it like I had gone briefly through it, but basically, yeah, you're right. It was a platform for the youth to basically, you know, regain agency of their lives, and to basically stand up to essentially the people that hold power, and to help make decisions that affect their future, and to help make decisions that they would be able to comply with and are comfortable with. Yes, there are case conferencing within child welfare, within mental health services. I know youth and transition workers also conduct case conferences. A lot of service providers conduct case conferences. I think what was unique about our project was that we brought both sectors together, and not necessarily out of, you know, I wasn't there looking for answers. I was there just really facilitating and on behalf of the youth, and ensuring that the youth was there to support the youth, for them to speak to everyone around the table, to get to say what it is that they need, and what from everyone, in order to be successful in you know, resolving their charges with the least intrusive measures, to you know, if it was to get out of custody, or was to get out of child welfare, certain placements, it was really for them to have a voice and to be heard. So
one of the things that Jessica did very well with is have these informal conferences one-on-one with all the participants before the actual conference happened. And a big part of that was setting the expectation and reframing the issues to the stakeholder, that this was going to be youth driven, and it wasn't going to be a forum where everyone could gather around and tell the young person what they needed to do, because that was in their best interest. And so that was something that took a lot of work of trying to ensure that the stakeholders didn't come in and create more damage with the perspective and the attitude that they were going to take towards this, especially people who are really well-meaning. You know, I've had years of experience, I'm doing what I think is going to help, but it wasn't where the youth wanted to be. And that kind of, I'll say, manipulation that goes on, again, supposedly in the best interest, is ultimately damaging. And so Jessica spent a lot of time making sure that that's not what the case conferences were a forum for.
I like to.
I'm able to ask a question in regards to the conference. not the conference, but the entire program in terms of crossover youth. So I've heard many from each and every one of you different tasks you guys have undertaken in order to bring this program to fruition. And I appreciate every single person's where everyone's coming from. However, I would ask, how are Black practitioners positioned in this program in order to inform some of the work you guys are doing? Because I've heard some amazing pointers from all four of you in regards to knowing that majority of crossover youth are racialized, right? And when I hear of these, I think of some of the trailblazers in our I don't know another word, but like trailblazers in our field that are doing some pretty phenomenal work around anti-Black racism. And one that comes to mind is like Kike Ojo and all of the fantastic work she's doing and has done in the past. Like in terms of consulting on the program, has anyone been consulted from my community in terms of ensuring that the program is meeting the best interest of our young people?
Sure. The program is completed now, but in the time that it was running and operational, we were trained by Kike, actually. She's the one who did our training. And then on our major steering committee, we had a number of racialized people who daily, certainly I consulted with daily, like Dr. Julian Hasford and like Dr. Beverly Jean Daniel. And so these are the people that were routinely working alongside of us for sure, but you're absolutely right. It was the racialized youth, mostly Black youth, that were treated very differently. I'll talk about Indigenous youth in a minute, but were treated very differently. They were treated more harshly. They were charged with more serious charges when they were in group homes. They were charged more often when they were in group homes. And I think the most compelling thing that we saw was they spent more time in pre-trial detention. In pre-trial detention, you've only been charged. You haven't even been convicted yet. They could spend up to a year in pre-trial detention. The Indigenous youth, the same thing. In terms of Indigenous youth, we had a program in Thunder Bay, and it was obviously Indigenous people largely that were informing the project, in fact, running the project. And the findings there were very similar to the findings in Toronto around Black youth, that in the youth justice system in Thunder Bay, 99% of the young people were Indigenous, and 99%. In fact, they couldn't remember when they saw a non-Indigenous young person in custody. And so the community had to respond to that and look at ways, alternative ways of ensuring that these young people were kept under the system. And as you know, most of the Indigenous youth that came into the system in, let's say, Thunder Bay, came from the far, far north, from small, remote Indigenous communities. And they were mostly coming down and the major reason was poverty, that they couldn't survive in terms of their lifestyle there, and so would commit offenses, and there weren't judges in their community, so they had to come to Thunder Bay, and they spent inordinate amounts of time in Thunder Bay because they couldn't return to their communities because of the geographic distances. Sorry. So Shantel, everything you said was dead on, was spot on, and not just in terms of centering race and anti-Black racism, but your whole piece around resilience. And I sometimes take offense to the word resilience, because often I think non-Black, non-Indigenous people use that word and it means to them, oh, it's okay, they're resilient. And it takes the responsibility away from non-Indigenous, non-Black people, non-racialized people. So I tend not to use that particular word, but it's from you. So,
no,
yeah.
I've struggled with resilience a lot since the beginning of my career. in regards to how it's used so frivolously, right? However, when you look deeper into my community, it's very hard not to use the word, because like if you were to define the word in relation to what you're seeing presented in the families within my community, that's literally what you see. You see a rubber band being stretched to its absolute maximum, and then the moment the systems are done with us, they let us go, and you see our families go right back. So it's really, really hard not to use the term resilient, but I'm very, very mindful when I do use it, but also recognizing the protective factors that the young people that are going to come into the program already have, right? We can equip them with so many protective factors, but they already come with those, and it's about honing in on them, and sometimes for a lot of these kids, it's about making them aware of their own strengths and the things that they engage in on a daily basis that are protective factors that nobody has ever sat down and really centered that conversation and said, hey, when you do this, it's a way, this is a means of you taking care of yourself and keeping yourself safe, and that's a strength, right? Many of our kids don't really hear those words, strength, and those positive words that they teach you in the CYW program and undergraduate studies. Our kids don't hear those. So when I've worked with my kids in various settings and I start using some of those words, I've gotten some pushback. I've gotten swear words, I have gotten cussed out of my name, and it's not because they don't like what I'm saying, it's because they have never heard their stories and their experience centered and then also followed with by you are strong, right? You are strong, you are this, you are, and coming up with words that actually reflect who they are. They're like, no, the system has been telling me this, and this is what I am, this is what I've become. Don't try to make me into something different. And it's about chipping away at a lot of the walls that they put up to keep themselves safe. So how do we look at Black youth differently, right? Because you said, I heard you say that there's differential treatment in many settings in which they go into, and then they take up space. But in conjunction with the differential treatment, you see complete and utter indifference, right? And when those two go hand in hand, it's a recipe for disaster. And that is a big reason why young people stay in pretrial custody for so long, because there's an indifference. There's a subliminal message that your life does not matter. I do not care. And a big piece of this work I've also seen is, Matthew, you said it in terms of some of the things they've done is not necessarily their fault, but I would challenge that and say that they did choose whatever action they partook in, and there is nothing wrong with holding a young person accountable. It helps them evolve and grow, but also positioning that conversation to say, hey, yes, you did steal such and such and such. I'm not going to penalize you, criminalize you, and dehumanize you for going into the mall and stealing that shirt. However, how can we ensure that this doesn't happen again, right? Instead of completely tearing apart a young person's life. So in doing this work, it's about accountability, but also ensuring that they're safe throughout the whole process. So it's very, it's like, it's very difficult.
I think what we came to see is that when you have a relational approach and somebody feels loved and taken care of and safe, they won't make those choices. And so if it's the system that's depriving them of love, depriving them of safety, depriving them of comfort, then really, I don't think it is worth spending a lot of time on the youth and whether they're accountable, and we need to use our resources to hold the system accountable for their failings that resulted in these actions that are, disruptive.
And how can we do that? I mean, there's so much that's practicable in terms of the learnings and the pillars that came out of this project. And I'm wondering, you know, there's ways in which we can practice individually and relationally with the young people with whom we work, and then how do we also advocate to make sure that collectively within these different systems we're being held to account? Like, are there recommendations, or in terms of next steps for the project? Maybe you can speak to that a little bit. Systems level change.
In terms of next steps, we would hope that we can take what we learned and having listened and learned a great deal, that we can share that with other communities and maybe perhaps even with other communities across the country. It was a great challenge in the project because, as Shantel noted, the young people involved have really complex needs. They're very, they often came into the judicial system, the criminal system, for very minor matters, and sometimes not so minor, but often minor matters. And then they would get involved in this never-ending stream of breaches for being isolated from their culture, being isolated from their family, living far away from their community, and wanting to run back. And so we had so many young people that represented that. We met with a number of people from the Indigenous community just this afternoon, and we had a really interesting conversation and learned a great deal from them. It's a matter of sharing what we've learned. I think that we have started a conversation. I hope that conversation continues. We noted in the 4 pilot sites that we were in, a real culture change, a real change of community. The community starting to own their responsibility to these young people, and that new ways of opening themselves to better ideas, newer ideas to try and address the trauma and the oppression that these young people had felt. We were very, very cognizant from the beginning that the criminal justice system is a blunt instrument, very important, as Shantel says, to hold people accountable for behavior. But it is not set as an institution that can deal really with, it can't deal at all really with trauma or oppression. And so we needed to make sure that the agency responsible for young persons, that being our Child Protection Agency, didn't dump them into the justice system and leave them there, but rather take ownership of them and join with the justice system to plan on what we could accomplish that would give better outcomes to their lives.
And there isn't much data on crossover youth, from what I understand. We don't know necessarily how many crossover youth there are in any particular community or in Ontario. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. We don't collect data. Child welfare collects data, and youth justice collects data, but the data doesn't ever come together, so we never know or understand how many crossover youth there are. But interestingly, there's in other countries just recently, they have been looking at crossover youth, and they do have the data. For example, in Australia, they've looked at 16,000 cases of crossover youth, and their findings are very similar to ours, but they're analyzing quantitative data. What we did is we really got to know these young people, not as many obviously, just 50, 100 young people, and we got to know them really well, and we're more sharing their voice than any kind of quantitative understanding. And when we went into it to start with, I have to tell you that we went into it as a pilot, as a service delivery piece, and as we went along, we saw how compelling the information was. Largely about anti-Black racism and the Indigenous youth, and so we felt we had to look at it differently. We had to look at it, and we had to report on it so that we could move the agenda forward. So we kind of had to shift gears halfway through, which we did, and the reports, and there's many reports, and the reports are really talking from the youth's perspective. We don't make recommendations on purpose because It's not up to us, it's up to community, it's up to institutions, it's up to government, it's up to whoever. It's up to them to take what we learned and then change accordingly. We can make recommendations till the cows come home, but doesn't mean people will act on them. So it's better to give compelling information about what we learned and hope, like Brian's saying, that other people will learn from it as well.
I know that the youth who participated put together a zine, which we've also shared. And I'm wondering, one of the questions from an attendee today was about how you engaged youth in the process for this particular project at all stages. You know, at YouthREX, we support youth programs in engaging youth at all stages of the design, development, and evaluation of program. I'm wondering if you can speak to, you know, briefly some of the successes or challenges that you found in engaging youth in this project, given histories of trauma and, you know, the challenge of engaging young people with adult allies.
That was probably the most difficult piece for us. Was I think in the beginning we fell back on traditional ways of engaging young people with advisory committees and so on and so forth, or bringing them to the larger provincial advisory table. And I believe, and they were young people that had lived experience. And I think that was not a good way of introducing the young people or taking information and having young people advise us. So we sort of tried different things. Each part of the province tried youth engagement or youth advisory approaches differently. But I think what we learned, and not just in Toronto, but in other sites as well, is the best, and Shantel, you'll speak to this for sure, the best way for youth to be engaged is by youth. And so it's youth to youth engagement. And so we had a peer-on-peer or a peer mentoring program. And so when, as Jessica was talking about the case conferences, when there was a young person sitting beside the young person that we were speaking about at the case conference, and they were able to advocate with that young person and educate, as you're talking about, Shantel, educating the young person about not just their rights, but what's available to them and how to use their voice and center them, then that worked out much better. And in Belleville, the youth mentoring program is still actually running. That was the most successful part of the project there, and certainly we started growing it here as well.
Shantel, did you want to add anything about your experiences of engaging and working alongside youth and trying to disrupt some of the power imbalances that are inherent to our roles in the systems?
So I've had a lot of experience doing that, but one that comes to mind, of course, is my program of 4 years. That was like my baby. I created that from scratch and watched it grow and evolve, Black Youth in Transition, right? But in doing that work with young people, it did take a lot of work and it took a lot of effort, right? There was still pushback. As much as I'm a Black woman, visibly strong and proud, and they can see that, and they can also see that I look young. They don't really know what my age is, but she looks young-ish, so maybe I can, no, they don't really know what to do with me, and that's okay. But also recognizing that as I'm trying to work alongside this young person, and I rarely disclose to them my own experience, I'm also a reflection of the system as well. So it's like, how do I navigate that as well as provide them the best care and support that they need, while also positioning myself in a manner that sends them a message that I'm here for you. This is confidential, but also, you know, being held accountable by another system that, like, so I stand in this, I think a lot of us Black practitioners and a lot of us practitioners across the field, we are in this position where we want so badly to work alongside these young people, but there's also red tape that we have to deal with, which I dealt with working in systems, doing systems work. There's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and the unfortunate part is we understand that, but the young people don't. So by the time they feel the bureaucracy and they feel all of those systemic issues, it comes to them in the form of, no, you can't do that. That is going against the policies of here, they don't understand the different levels. And like, I think that's the defeating part of working alongside of them. But in a community grassroots level, I was able to do a lot more, I guess you can call it rugged work. My work was raw and real. And sometimes I would be right on the ground level with them. And I'm being really honest. I had kids who would come in and they wanted to lay on the, they want to just, they call it kick up. So you just want to kick up, that's it. But in terms of getting through to them and walking alongside them, walking alongside them in this journey, am I going to sit in this chair and create a power struggle and a power imbalance, or am I going to go kick up with you, right? And a lot of times it was the very simple things that really assisted me in working alongside them. There has been many times in my practice where I keep a very, very hard front in terms of working with young people. And then there have been times when I worked at the Provincial Advocate's Office, when I worked at CAS, when I worked in community, where unfortunately, what we keep from a lot of our colleagues and coworkers is that, yes, I am a visibly Black woman and I'm not immune to a lot of the things that these young people are going through. And I feel, and I would catch myself in moments with young people where I'm crying alongside them, right? And we're doing this healing work together, and the spirituality is there. I am not a religious person, but I'm a very spiritual person, and utilizing that in terms of walking alongside them. I'm seeing a lot of Black youth veer away from the norms that have been set out in our cultures and our communities, and they're taking on and uprooting their own identities, right? And even doing that is creating trauma. So working alongside them is like, it's Dr. Finlay, as you said, it's definitely complex. There's a lot of components. Doing the work that I did over the course of 4 years, I was able to pull in numerous individuals on the program. But even with like 5, 6, 7, 8 practitioners on my program, there was always something missing. There's an LGBTQ element missing. There's a mental health element missing, and it's not easy to just go and hire a mental health professional to come and work with these young people, because there is a wide mistrust in my community of the mental health system. I'm a practitioner in this field. I've done extensive work, and even I'm terrified of the doctors and do everything in my power not to go, right? So if I am also feeling this way, it's how am I supposed to push young people who are 15 to 20 years younger than me to go and access, supports from mental health professionals, when if you were to ask me, I'm really terrified, right? And it's because there's a lot of layers to that. It's about being well presenting. It's about as a Black individual not being not being believed as much as your non-racialized counterparts, and we end up shutting down. So working alongside young people, I've recognized that over my work with them, different elements and struggles have come up, and the difficulty and struggle is, how do we address these in a healthy manner that centers their experience and centers race? And I'm always going to go back to race, because Black young people are very good at pretending that that's not an issue, because we have been told over the course of our lives not to talk about it, don't bring it up, don't allude to it. You already know you're going to be criminalized when you walk down the street. So the more you assimilate, the easier it is to survive, right? So, but once you start uncovering those issues, you realize there are a plethora of challenges that come with that. So in terms of my experience working alongside youth, especially even in the child welfare system, also faced a lot of pushback in terms of the work that I did with my young kids, and trying to provide wraparound services. It was very, very hard. And as somebody who started my career in a grassroots organization, I learned from the moment I walked through that door, from my senior supervisor and executive director, how to be very strategic in doing work from a frontline level. So after having that experience and going to child welfare and being extremely creative in how I support these young people, right? If I can't support them in one way as outlined by the system, I can support them in other ways. In that I've hired young people I've worked with from one job onto my program when I worked in. And so it's about really being creative and how to keep those connections, how to build a hub. That's one term that I really adopted from a lot of my mentors, and it's about creating a hub of safety, one place. And I also find, and it's no fault to any of ours, it's a systemic issue as well, but we have these kids who have transportation challenges running all around the city for supports. You need a mentor, go to the west. You need mental health supports, go to the east. You need to talk to this person, you gotta go up north. And they don't even have a bus token, right? So how do we create this hub of support where they can get what they need in one building? And even if it doesn't work for them, I've seen young people who have gone in for supports in my organization and come out with a completely different support. Like, I sent you to that program to do A, B, and C, and you came out of that program grasping D, E, and F from it. It doesn't matter to me as long as you got something from it and it's creating some sort of cushion of protection for you. That's what matters, right? So yeah, how do we create that hub of support and not have young people having to go to all different channels to access support, because that's a challenge and that's a barrier. It's a very heightened challenge in my community because a lot of young people were conditioned not to really go and ask for help, especially around issues of mental health. So when you're now asking a young person to travel to CAMH from all the way up in the east, there is a fear, there is a hesitation, there's a strong apprehension. So yeah, I've had my ups and I've also had my downs of working alongside young people, and sometimes they drain me. However, I know I'm doing the work, and I've recognized over the past couple of years I've actually just engaged in instead of beating around the bush, because I use certain frameworks in my practice that I don't necessarily always allude to right there in the moment with them, but sometimes I will talk about it. I've worked with kids around housing, and they don't really understand the grand scheme of things. So it's about just being honest. And I've also taught my colleagues the same thing. Sometimes they're a little bit hesitant. It's about really breaking down that person's identity and just explaining to them how the challenges present themselves when you are Black, you are young, you are on ODSP, you have child welfare involvement, you have a criminal history, whether it was at your fault at any fault of your own or the system's fault, it's still there. When you put all of these different layers about your identity together, how does that hinder you from gaining access to housing, right? Where everybody knows, at least a lot of the adults I've worked with, that Toronto's housing market is extremely racist, it's sexist, it's very oppressive in terms of socioeconomic status and social location, right? And a lot of time we know these things, but as I also believe in not equipping young people with toolboxes and not simultaneously also equipping their caregivers with a toolbox so that they can go home and do the work together. Where the danger comes in is not telling young people why we're doing what we're doing. I have had these conversations with kids, and it has resulted in tears and hurt and pain, and it's about just holding that space to like tell them you're going to survive this, and the system, you are not responsible for this system, right? And it's just, I need you to know this so that then you and the protective factors I've seen you employ, that you will be able to do it again, right? There's a danger in sending kids out into this world without telling them what the world is going to do to them, right? Whether you're a racialized practitioner like myself, or whether you are a white practitioner, you can still have these conversations with young people. And sometimes we feel so defeated because we have this overarching system and we try and we pull and we prod and we're still met with brick walls. But what can we do from the ground level to mitigate these experiences or to prevent experiences, right? And to prevent experiences that will result in further trauma. The housing market can be extremely traumatizing to these 16-year-old kids who are just trying to get their first rooming house. They're 17 or 18, and you don't tell them the truth. You don't tell them that, hey, and you break down their intersectional identity and explain to them exactly the ways in which the Toronto's housing market is going to make them crash. You actually do a disservice to them. You do a large disservice, right? So
yeah, I think there's so much. Yeah, I think being creative, centering, the young person. You talked a lot about use itself and your relational dynamics with young people. There's so much to talk about, and I'm very sorry that we are at the end of our time together for today. We really wanted to explore the Crossover Youth Project as an entry point to a conversation that you have all contributed to. We're so grateful. We're interested in hearing from folks who participated today, what they would like to see us delve into in part 2. We definitely want to continue this conversation offline, and we hope to bring you all together again to continue it online. And I thank each of you for your time, for sharing your perspectives, for sharing the information that came from this project, but also your frontline and lived experience as well. We really, really appreciate it at YouthREX, and we hope that we can continue this in a part 2. And if folks have questions for our panelists, please send them to us at info@youthrex.com. If there's something that we didn't have time to address today, we'll certainly try to respond. And this webinar will be available for folks to revisit on our Knowledge Hub. And we look forward to the next conversation, and thank all of our panelists and all of our guests for joining us this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all.